we have to, I think, trust in a way that working on our processes, like growing as much as we can, will eventually give the best outcomes to ourselves and to those we care about. It can seem like it's being loving to like get overly focused on outcomes, but I think that always in some way comes undone, especially if we feel like something has failed. So we always need to be renewing the sense of like, yes, it's not going to work out perfectly every time. We can never be attached to outcomes.
Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of The Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majors. Kevin, good to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. Well, Kevin, we have a great question today that we can center our episode on. And I think it's on a question that you wanted to talk about anyway, so it works out pretty well. Without further ado, let me just read this question, which is from one of our best listeners, avid OptimalWork user, great person. He says, can you talk more about professional success as a pseudo-ideal? I don't see how it's exhaustible because you can always have more success. So this is referring to an episode a couple episodes back where we had talked about pseudo-ideals, and one of the features of them that's bad is that they're exhaustible. So it's not something you want to aim for. But he says maybe success is inexhaustible. He continues. Also, how do you convince someone from a non-religious worldview that it's not an ideal and won't make them happy, and that only striving for ideals will make them happy? So I guess this is referring to the fact that many religious traditions caution against, the total pursuit of money, success, power, fame, and so forth. And so the question is, if someone doesn't have that worldview, that religious worldview, how do you encourage them to not pursue those things and instead pursue ideals? So Kevin, I turn this question over to you.
All right, Sharif, that's a great question. So I think that my most direct answer is that success is an outcome, and no outcome makes us happy, because happiness is a process. So there are outcomes and there are processes, and those are two distinct ways of thinking about what we're aiming for. Aiming for outcomes is left-brained. Process goals, on the other hand, are right-brained. And so growing in an ideal, that's a kind of process. It's a trajectory. Deepening bonds are processes. They're interpersonal processes. So when you're trying to deepen bonds, they can always get deeper. When you're trying to grow in ideals, you can always go further. But success, if you specify it, it's attainable. So maybe success for some people is making $1 million. Okay, then that would be their stand-in for success. So, and then that could be attained, but then they would have to change it. It's inexhaustible. In the sense, it always is going to be the goalpost to keep moving. But that's not really being inexhaustible, because then like making money would be an ideal again, because you can always then you can always make more money. No, the idea is that these are outcomes. So the real question is, like, maybe it's good for us to dive into what's the difference between outcomes and processes.
Yeah, actually, it seems like another way to put it is means and ends, but I have a feeling you're not going to like that. That the outcome is the end. So obviously, the obvious analogy here is climbing a mountain. The end is to get to the top, which is the outcome, and then the means is climbing it, which is a process. So, but that's not exactly what you're saying here, is it?
No, I would say it's more like outcomes are means and processes are progressive ends. So if your goal is physical fitness, climbing a mountain is one particular outcome toward the goal of being physically fit. So that physical fitness is a kind of process goal. You can become more and more healthy. Every ideal, you can do more and more. So it might be that your goal is to get home for dinner by 5:30. And that's just an outcome. That's a means to the end, which is being available for your family. So I think it might be the other way around. I think the right brain is always about ends and the left brain is about means. But then, like in one way though, you're right. the particular thing you're trying to do right now will have an end, which is the outcome you're trying to get. But that always has to be serving something that's deeper. So one way that we teach people this distinction is in doing a golden hour and looking at what in this next hour of work that you're about to do, are you just trying to get it done, which is the outcome? Or are you trying to grow in some way and serve others, which are processes? So one big distinction between outcomes and processes is that the processes are basically internal to you, but the outcomes are external. So it's like outcomes are the weights that you lift at the gym, but the growing muscle is inside of you. And that's the process you're aiming for. So you do need externals, but only insofar as they help you to build the internals. So this thing about outcomes are always in some way external to us. Processes are always in some way internal to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one example that comes to mind, I think Thomas Sterner gives it in The Practicing Mind, which I think is a lot about this distinction, the book. And he talks about the Japanese in the archery team for the Olympics. The Japanese team they seem to celebrate. He couldn't figure out why they were celebrating like after they would shoot because it wasn't a particularly good shot. The Americans would always respond when they got a bullseye, like they would be happy about it. And if they didn't, they would be frustrated. And then I think he realized that the Japanese team, they're celebrating when they have good technique, whether they hit the bullseye or not. They're just happy that they released it properly. I don't know exactly how archery works, but so would that be illustrating this distinction that of focusing on process, form, technique?
I think sports and music are always perfect examples of this. So if you're focusing on, the archery example that Thomas Sterner talks about that, I think always of like tennis, you could get fixated on getting a certain percent of balls over the net, or you could just focus on one aspect of your forehand. So, making eye contact when the ball hits the racket, that you're seeing it. The head of the racket is at shoulder level at the end of follow through. You can work on these issues of form. Focusing on form or the process will always in the end give you the best outcomes. But if you are too fixated on just getting the ball over the net, you're going to take shortcuts with form, and that actually stops you from growing. And I think this is always the case, that getting focused on outcomes hampers growth. It seems like it's justifiable in the short term. There's always some kind of provisional mentality. Like, right now, we just have to do this, focus on this outcome. But in the end, it always works against growth, because you're in some way prioritizing an external over your own internal growing.
Okay, one possible objection to this is, or maybe it's a trap that someone falls into. Okay, I can see that being focused on process is important, and in fact, it's what yields the best outcomes over time. So I'm not really buying into it. I'm just using this process focus to get the best outcomes in the long run. Is that an issue here?
Yeah, and so the proof then is what happens with failure. So focusing on processes makes you indifferent to success and failure to some degree. Because basically every process goal is a kind of mastery. You're mastering a kind of knowledge, you're mastering a skill, you're mastering an ideal. Every process goal is a form of mastery. So you could call them mastery goals. If you're aiming for mastery, then success and failure are very different things to you than if you're aiming for outcomes. So failure can be crushing if you're just focused on outcomes. But if your goal is mastery, you will grow in mastery regardless of succeeding or failing. That's a huge freedom then that people can have, to have freedom from their fear of failure, so that you're kind of freedom from discouragement. So you can learn from failure to grow in mastery, which means in the long run, you're going to fail a lot less. So again, if you prioritize your own growing in mastery, you will master whatever the skills and ideals are that would help you to thrive at that activity. So more so than trying to take a shortcut by just getting like some kind of outcome.
Okay, suppose I have some goals and then I have my strategy for achieving those goals. So I think it's one thing to say, okay, your strategy should be more process focused. You shouldn't get so concerned with the outcomes. You should focus on your strategy and refining your strategy, and the process. Your strategy should be about refining the process, and that's how you should go about achieving your goal. But I think what you're saying also is that your very goal should be the improved process, not the outcome.
Yes, that you're aiming to grow in mastery. So, and that is always accomplishable.
That seems like a bitter pill to swallow because, I mean, if I'm an archer, say, or a weightlifter or a musician, I mean, I want to, like a musician, I want to play the piece as well as possible. That's my goal. No? I mean, but my goal is to be the best musician or be the most musical or something. I don't.
Oh, no, mastering that piece is a skill that you're aiming to grow in. If you happen to make a mistake, that doesn't take away your mastery. So you get less afraid of mistakes. It's the same in learning to speak a foreign language. So you might want to come across like more fluent, than maybe you really are. So you get afraid of making mistakes, and you treat mistakes as if they're failures. Whereas a mistake in trying to speak another language just helps you to grow in mastery. As long as you're learning while trying to do it and you're like aiming to stretch yourself and improve your mastery, then in fact, you should be trying to make as many mistakes as you can. Talk to people in that language all day long, make mistakes all day long, and you'll be growing in mastery hour by hour. So the fastest way to learn another language is to get immersed in it and with no speaking of your own language, your native language, for weeks. And that actually is like proven to be the fastest way of learning a language. And it's all mistakes in the beginning, but that's actually the idea. You embrace mistakes and are like, you learn from everything. So if you're quick to learn, and that's the thing about focusing on mastery is you will learn from failure and from success. You're not just hoping to get lucky, and then somehow get by. So when people are, have outcome goals in mind, often I think they're looking to be lucky. Like somehow they'll be and they'll get this thing without actually having to do the mastery work. But I think there's no replacing the centrality of mastery to attain the outcomes that they would desire. Once you're aiming for real mastery, I think then you can use outcomes as a way of getting it. So then you could be thinking about like, how do you set more quantifiable goals to learn this piano piece? And I'm going to practice it for 10 minutes a day or 20 minutes or an hour. So you can use little outcomes, but the goal then, the real end is actually the growth in mastery.
Okay. Now, one thing I think would be interesting to talk about that we always talk about ideals and service as the ultimate purpose of work. And so I'm wondering how this ties in, because you're saying, process goals are greater than outcome goals, but it seems like, okay, if your goal is about the technical process of mastering some skill or craft, that still falls short of this idea of ideals and service.
Oh, those are just the highest forms of process.
Okay.
So that the higher you go, to always be improving the service you give is an essential part of the spirit of service. So it has built within it, like to really be serving others is to serve them in the best way that you can. And that means to always be improving how you serve them. And same with ideals.
Does that mean in the same way with in terms of the outcomes of how you're serving and what you do to serve others? Again, you shouldn't be caught up too much with the outcomes that you're achieving, but just the process of.
You would like to be, I think you should be learning from your outcomes always. So when I'm trying to improve my work in seeing patients, I do have to look and see, like, generally speaking, how many sessions, am I spending with people? How many sessions to a breakthrough? What do I do if there's no breakthrough? Am I re-strategizing that? So you're always learning from your outcomes. And then along the way, you get better and better at attaining outcomes. But then you're still always trying to learn and improve. And every profession has an unlimited potential for growth. So you can always be learning more about how to master your craft. And you'll see that when you're just focusing on what does it look like to improve my work? What's the next level for me in my job? Then you think about what are the skills, the ideals, and the bonds that you can be deepening, in that setting.
Yeah. And actually, that's where I was going to go next was how do we go about setting these process goals? Precisely because there's unlimited growth. And so it seems like you could gravitate towards outcome goals just because they're more concrete. They might seem more attainable. But whereas a process goal might seem a little more abstract, and because there's this possibility of infinite growth, how do I know what's the right next step for me?
Just to go a little deeper then, process goals are always growth oriented. So the question is, how can I grow the most to be able to accomplish these things? Like, maybe, but the main thing, and so it's always that there's a continuum. Outcomes are always yes or no. They're dichotomous, and they lend themselves to black and white thinking, which is a real kind of cognitive distortion. But that's what happens. That's the left brain pitfall, with outcome goals, is that it's just like, is either yes or no in terms of do we attain it. Process goals are always a continuum, a trajectory of growth. So if you just start to ask yourself, like, in the course of my work, how would I want to be improving? Or in the course of a relationship, how would I want the relationship to be improving? In my skills in this sport, in my skills with this music, in my knowledge of this area, how would I want that knowledge to be improving? The key to process goals is that there's a trajectory. Now, once you're on the trajectory, then success and failure doesn't matter so much, and the outcomes don't matter so much. So if you feel like, like if I felt like I was really gaining momentum in spoken Spanish, then I'm not going to be too worried about objectively what level is my Spanish. It's the same with any kind of virtue. If you're growing in an ideal and you feel yourself growing in it, you're not going to be worried about objectively measuring as if you could, where exactly am I on this scale? So this is, the idea is that when you're aiming for these processes and deepening them, one benefit is you're immune to competitiveness. You stop comparing yourself to others. So that means then that when people are focused on outcomes, they're more prone to be competitive, they're more prone to be discouraged, they're more prone to have fear of failure. That's all because of the outcome goals that they've kind of gotten into and they've been aiming for. Most of the time, I believe that's unconscious. The thing about outcome goals is because it's left-brained, it's highly automated. They're just default. They're built in. But process goals always have to be deliberate. You never automatically are aiming to grow in some way. So outcome goals are always fixed, and it's a kind of snapshot of what we want a victory to look like, and it's just built into us, and they're by default what we're aiming for. If we don't pause and consciously try to think of a trajectory and what does growth look like.
They're easy to imagine, an outcome goal.
Yes.
Which actually that connects to, we often encourage people to do visualizations to visualize, what the task would look like well done, or what it would look like to do this with such and such an ideal. I wonder, it seems like that imagination lends itself so much towards getting focused on an outcome.
Yeah. So I would say that ideals all contain a certain elan or spirit within them that really that's what we're catching. We're trying to get the feel for it, you could say. Like, to what does that ideal feel like? So that then people can think of it applying to many different situations. So once you get the feel for what it's like to be cheerful, no matter how you otherwise feel internally, and you start to love that, that kind of quality, then it becomes more attractive to you and you start to practice it more. And it's the same with anything, same with any of the other ideals. So I think ideals, this is another thing about these process goals, is that they actually are the image of the growth you're trying to attain. And so they tell you how to attain it. But outcome goals tell you nothing about how to attain it. So for instance, if you're talking about a salesperson, the outcome goal could be, to make $1 million in sales this year. Okay, that tells you nothing about how to get there. A process goal might be, if you think of what are the habits of the most successful salespeople, and you start to think about, like, I am not a salesperson, so I have no idea what those habits might be. But let's say it's a certain kind of thoughtfulness in replying to every inquiry, for instance. Well, that would be then a habit you could try to develop. So working on that kind of shows you the path of growth. I think maybe the idea of like the tennis swing is a little easier, because you can see that first, the first thing is just making eye contact when the ball hits the racket, like that you see that with your eyes. So, and then practicing that until now that's second nature, and then it's about the follow through, let's say, and then where does the racket end? Okay, so you can see that like these process goals, just aiming at practicing that movement, that form, they're stackable. And it's kind of like, this just shows you what growth looks like, that you have first one thing and then the next and then the next, versus get the ball over the net 90% of the time, which tells you nothing about how to do it. So if people end up feeling perplexed and discouraged, it's because of the outcome goal.
Yeah. And then part of that too is with the process you described, you've broken it down into smaller and smaller components. And so it's almost like the tranquility of order exercise.
Exactly.
Where the outcome is just this big thing. It feels like, success, failure dichotomy. But when you break it down into all these components and you work the process, it's like you put order into your growth, and now your growth takes place along a continuum of you improve this and then this and then this.
And that's this kind of paradox that with ideals as a kind of prototype of process goals, yes, the ideal is in a way unattainable, but the trajectory is immediately attainable. So I can't be perfectly loving right now, but I can immediately be on the path right now of being more loving. And that's a beautiful thing about these, that you're always able to get on the trajectory. It doesn't matter where you are right now. As long as you're working on it and you're trying to find ways of improving, you are going to make meaningful progress. That's completely different with outcomes, which there may be nothing I can do right now to achieve this outcome. So like a student taking a class, they might be focused on getting an A in the class. Well, right now in this next hour of study, there's nothing they can do to get that A. Because it's just this like a bigger outcome, they'll come later. But if their goal is mastering the material, they can right now grow in mastering this material. So then they actually do make real meaningful progress in this hour of study, in that mastery. And we know that mastering the material is a great way of ensuring your grades are higher. It's not perfect, because again, outcomes may not be in your control. Like whether you get 100 on, I've had the experience of doing what I thought was an absolutely perfect test and then getting an unfairly low grade on it. So where it's like, I know it was like, but there's like one little tiny mistake and they're like, okay, that's like -10. So, okay, you just can't control it.
Or they just put a question on that you have no idea what it is.
It could be. None of those would take away the actual level of mastery of the material I had attained. And so if what you care about is the mastery of the material, these things don't hurt so much. It's like, well, whatever. I'm confident that I love the subject now and I got really into it. And I think and maybe it's a stimulus then. Okay, I need to there's still more I can learn. So,
yeah. Wonderful, Kevin. Well, I think we're basically out of time, and we've covered a lot of good ground today. Do you have any other final thoughts you want to add here, or summary? Or
Only that we have to, I think, trust in a way that working on our processes, like growing as much as we can, will eventually give the best outcomes to ourselves and to those we care about. It can seem like it's being loving to like get overly focused on outcomes, but I think that always in some way comes undone, especially if we feel like something has failed. So we always need to be renewing the sense of like, yes, it's not going to work out perfectly every time. We can never be attached to outcomes. Instead, double down on what can we use, what can we grow in terms of mastery. How do we then what's the next step forward in mastery that we can take right now?
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Kevin, thanks so much for this.
All right, Sharif, thanks a lot.
All right, something I really needed.
Good, we all do.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, we'll be back next week.